Hi, good morning everyone. So, today we are going to talk about Redux and Redux Forms with React Native. Let's have a look about the content. So, first we have the introduction to Redux and getting started with Redux. After that, we are having pros and cons of the Redux and introduction and getting started with Redux Forms. And the latter part, we have a simple demo and a Q&A session. First, what is Redux? As per the documentation, Redux is a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. Let me explain that. Redux is a state container for JavaScript application. It is mostly paired with React, where it takes the control of state away from the component and gives it to a centralized space called store. Let's explain that with the following pictures. Let's assume you are having an application with 5 major components, and each component has 2 child components. So each component manages its state. However, the situation occurs where we have to share state with child component, or a child component wants to modify the parent's state. So that will be a problem. While an application grows to a higher number of components, maintaining the data consistency becomes much more challengeable. So it's not easy task to manage each component state while sharing it with many other components, and it can have some data inconsistency bugs. So it is fearsome to the nightmare for front-end developers. So as shown in the image, Redux take away the responsibility from individual components to manage a state. Instead, we create a single store that handles our state management. On top of all of that, all communication regarding the updating, creating, deleting, or whatever data happens via the store. It prevents the data inconsistency bugs from appearing. Moreover, components can listen to the state changes to update the UI and avoid these data inconsistency bugs. And why do we need Redux? It is predictable. It is make it easier to understand how the data flow works in our application, and it is centralizing the state make it easier to implement things like logging changes to the application or persistent data between page refreshes, and we can access the store in anywhere in the application. With the debugging tool called DevTools, it is easier to trace when, where, why, how the application state change. We can have insights of our state changes with that, and it is make it easier to debugging and testing process. About the flexibility, Redux works with any UI layer such as Vue, Angular, or React. And it has a large ecosystem of add-ons and plugins which your needs. Next, we have the high level of Redux lifecycle. So we have actions, and we trigger actions, and it goes to reducers. Reducers go to store, and we can subscribe to the store. Let's discuss in the next slide. So Redux has 4 major basic core concepts, which are actions, reducers, store, and the dispatch. Actions. What is action? Action is a simple object that describes what are the changes that we want. It's the action descriptor. It has it can have a type and a payload. And the reducers. Reducers are the function that we'll use to transform our store state, because it is reading the action and it's changing the state as per the action. And you all know it has a store, and the current Redux application state lives in the object called store. That will be our centralized store. And the most important function of the Redux is dispatch. That is the method that we are using to trigger actions. Then it provides the luxury to trigger the actions in anywhere and any time. So we have that. Next, what are the pros and cons of the Redux? We have good side and bad side as well. As the pros, we have a centralized store. So we can manage the state. We don't need to worry about accessing the state in child components or parents. So that's it. and prevent unnecessary re-renders. We don't need to worry about the re-renders with Redux. Otherwise, we need to check about React hooks and state changes, and we need to block those. And Redux handle this for us. At the debugging process, as we discussed, there is a tool called DevTools, Redux DevTools. So for React Native, it is named as React Native Debugger. So it make it easier to debugging and testing. We can check the insights of our state changes. So that will be easy. About the ecosystem, it has very large community support and it has very large ecosystems of add-ons and plugins. Let's move to the cons. Currently, it doesn't have encapsulation. So in anywhere in the application, the child can check the parent's store state, and any component can access to the centralized store. About the boilerplating, there will be some boilerplating as well. In the actions and reducers, we are using same kind of code structure over and over again. About the immutable state, in Redux, we can't actually edit the state of the Redux. We only can replace the previous state with the newer state. And about the complexity, we can't integrate instantly Redux with our React app. We need to go through some basic concepts and fundamentals as well, and we need to have a proper architecture, and it is kind of complex to develop instantly. Finally, we have Redux Forms. What is Redux Forms? As per the documentation, Redux Form is a higher order component using React and Redux to keep form state in a Redux store. When we are dealing with forms, it can be some kind of tricky. While we are using large number of fields, then we need to take care of things such as validation, field type, and other stuffs. While developing forms with React and Redux, we need to keep the form information in the store. Redux Form is quite convenient way to make the implementation forms easier and quicker, and it keeps track all the common application events like values, focus, validated, warnings, errors, and so many things. Let's check more about Redux Forms. It has three major things in Redux Forms: Redux Reducer, also known as the Form Reducer, and React High Order Component, Redux Form, and the Field Wrapper. About the Redux Form Reducer, it is also acting like a simple Redux reducer. That is the function that tells how to update the Redux store based on changes coming from our application form. That leads into our form component and make the changes in the store. About the Redux form function, that is the function we are using to configure the Redux form to our component. It have a prop call form, which is we want to specify a name, and if you are using some kind of sync validation, we need to pass that to that function. And if you are using any initial values, we need to configure those as well. Field component. Field component is the most important component with Redux Forms because that is the component that we are using to connect our fields with the Redux state and Redux form. So it has two required fields. First one is name. We need to specify a field name. And the component. Component means what is the component that we are rendering here. We need to specify the component. As an example, it can be an input field or drop down or date picker, anything. As we discussed, the validation, Redux Forms make it easier, the validation process as well. Because without Redux, we need to handle each and every thing with validation. So mainly it provides 4 types of validation approaches: sync validation, field level validation, submit validation, and async validation. So what is sync validation? Sync validation takes an object of form values. That means it returns all the form values and checks the validity and returns the object of errors. We will look into that in later part. Field level validation. field level validation is something different than sync validation. It is using individual validators for each field. So we need to predefine the validators for each field. And the benefit of this is we can specify one or more validators for single fields. So that will be advantage. About the submit validation, it returns a rejected promise from onSubmit function. Normally, this is using for server-side validation. When we are returning something from server, we can use the submit validation. About the async validation, this is also using for server-side validation. Asynchronous validation function that takes our object form values and Redux dispatch functions and return a promise either rejects or error or resolves. Let's have a small demo about the things we discussed. I have created the sample app for the demonstration purposes. So I'll explain the code first. So we have the app directory and it has the index, and here we have the Redux provider. I think you all have some experience with Redux. So this is the configuration part for the Redux, and here we have the store index. This is where we are configuring the Redux store with the reducers, and here we have the root reducer, and it has the form reducer that we have discussed with Redux Forms. We need to configure the form in here. And I have a component directory and a feature called form. About the Redux lifecycle, these are the sample actions and constants that I have created. So as you can see, these are the action types. And this is an example action, and which is called save form data. So it can have a type and it can have a payload as well. About the reducers, this is the function that check the actions and do the necessary changes for the state. So it's checking the following actions and changing the state as per the action. So this is the reducer. Okay, let's move to the our component. So this is our sample component for the demo. When we are configuring Redux Forms with React Native, we need to import two main components from Redux Form. First one is Redux Form component and the field component. First thing we need to do is we need to configure the Redux form. Then here's that part. We need to specify a form name. I have assigned the form name as sample. And if you are using any sync validation, we need to pass the sync validation function here. We'll get back into that. Okay. About next, the field wrapper. As we discussed, the field wrapper is the component that we are using to connect our field with Redux store. So it has a name. This will be our layer. This will be our field name, and it has the component that shows what is the component that we are rendering here. So I have created the sample input field here, and it is some kind of change than a normal input field, because when we are wrapping this input field with the field wrapper, it has special props like onChange function and a meta property. I'll start with the onChange function. OnChange function is the function that listening to our state changes, value changes of the input field or whatever. So we need to bind that with the onChange value change function of our input field or our input component. So I have assigned it here. About the metaprop. Metaprops return such very valuable properties of our field, such as touch, error, warnings, or if there is any initial values. This also returns with the meta function. With using this meta properties, we can integrate the error message and error styles with our Redux field. As you can see, I have created a simple error function as well. I'm checking the error is true or not, and checking the touch status, and showing the error message here. So with these stuffs, make Redux Forms make it easier to develop those validation stuffs. And back to the main component. Let's have a look about this component with the debugger. And this is the dev tools I have mentioned in the session. It shows the states, actions, and difference. Let's check the status. So we have the form reducer for Redux Forms, and here we have the sample form, the name that we gave in our component. And the sample form has 3 registered fields, which are first name, last name, and the email. And each and every property has name and a type. Okay. Then let's type something in this. I'll let my name as this. I'll let some email. Okay, you can see the value property here in the form reducer, and it will real-time updates the session form values with the Redux store. So we don't need to worry about any of those things. Redux Forms handles that for us. Let's move to the validation. About the sync validation. Let's start with the sync validation. As we discussed, sync validation returns object of values just like this, and we can check that and validate those, and we need to return object of errors. Here you can see the validation for the first name. I'm checking the value of first name is available or not, and I am assigned the error of first name as required, and I'm checking the text length and setting the error as the character limit is increased, and returning the all errors. So this function is needs to pass with the Redux form function as the second parameter. We need to specify what is the validation function of our application. So let's add that. Refresh the application. Okay. Let's submit this without any values. Okay, you can see I have we are having some kind of runtime issue with the debugger. Okay, I'll submit it again. So you can see we are having a required error because we don't have any values in first name. Okay, let's check it with the form. So here you can see it shows us as there is a sync error for first name called required. So this is real time we update the issues as errors as well. So this is much more simpler than the other approaches. And let's have a look about the field level validation. In field level validation, we need to specify, we need to predefine the validation that we want. I have already declared some validation in a common place. So we have required and max length and a phone number and email. About the required and max length, here you can see I am checking the value, and if it is true or not, we are returning the error called required and checking the max length. And another advantage of Redux Forms is we can use regex as well with these validations. So I have I'm checking the phone number with the Redux, regex, and email as well. So we need to import these validators to our application. So I have already imported those things. In field component, there is an optional property called validate, where we are using the validators for our component. It can be an object or array, because we can use one or more validators for every field. So I'll add required to all of these fields. This is how we are going to implement field validation in Redux Forms, and we don't need to pass anything with the Redux form function. So let's have a look about field level validation. So you can see we have added the required validator for all three fields. Sorry, I'm having the debugging issue again. And we have added the required validator for all three fields. So it's getting error like this. When we are typing on it, it goes back. And this is about the field level validation. About the other approaches, I'm not going to talk deeper in this session because we don't have much time. So let's move to the slide again. Okay. Pros and cons of the Redux Forms. As we discussed, it is very easy to develop with our Redux application because it doesn't have any complex configuration, or it doesn't have any complex validation or something. About the validation process is much more harder without these things. And then Redux Forms provide us 4 best approaches for handle those validations. So we don't need to worry much about that. While we are using Redux for this, it has a centralized form data. Let's assume you are creating multiple forms in a feature. So you can access each and every form data in a centralized place. So you don't need to worry about passing the first form values to the child components of that. So that will be advantage. About the cons, storing the form data in Redux will be a disadvantage because anywhere in the application we can access the form data. That will be a disadvantage. About the issues, currently the GitHub repository of Redux Forms has 400 plus active bugs for now. So that will be a disadvantage. About the performance, when we are using this with the larger scale application, it can have some kind of performance issue with the Redux store because it's real-timely updating the form values with the Redux store. So that will be a disadvantage. Then we have came to the end of this session. Do you have any questions?
Hi, Ashan. Actually, that's a great presentation. So I guess there's no question on the end. No? Thanks a lot, Ashan, and over to you.
Okay. Okay, then here's the end of this session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ashan. Great tech talk.